one of our sons, we put him into a junior college, and he started taking some courses, and he'd never been in a classroom environment, so we realized that he was totally unprepared for that experience, and he had a really hard time, so we thought, okay, we'll put him into the high school there, and award-winning high school. It's got some of the best, it's quote-unquote, in all the real estate advertising, they always say best schools in the nation. So anyway, he went there, and what we found out later from some of the teachers that had taught there is that the school it's basically run like a prison. It looks like a prison. In fact, most of the schools in California look like prisons, and there's a reason for that. It's actually the prisons that are designed like the schools. And the reason for that is they figure something went wrong at about second or third grade. So California prisons are actually designed like elementary schools to get the inmates back into that mentality of doing what they're told. And I think what's happening in a lot of the schools around the country is that increasingly there's just constant monitoring. They're monitored for everything. They had to take permission to go to the bathroom, to come back. And really what's I think deeply troubling for me, especially at the high school age, is if you look at, there's a book called The Case Against Adolescence, which argues that this infantilization of children moving into adulthood and keeping them as children is actually one of the things that creates adolescent rebellion. John Taylor Gatto told me of an experience they had in a school in the inner city in New York, and he was teacher of the year in a state that has over 50,000 teachers. He was actually teacher of the year in that state. It was unprecedented in New York City and the state of New York 4 times. John Taylor Gatto, who did a seminar here with us, one of the things that he said is that his entire career was subverting the system. And he would wear a 3-piece suit, and he would go to school and look like a conservative, but he said he had a completely radical agenda, which was to really subvert everything that was going on in that school, to the point where he actually at one time stole all of the tests from the principal's office and threw this school into complete chaos for 2 weeks. I mean, this is how radical this man was. And yet, his students consistently were some of the most successful students. And they went on, many of them, to have very successful careers, and several of them attributed their success to having had him as a teacher. So many of us have had great teachers, but many of us have also suffered the difficulties of these school systems that we find ourselves in. Just to give you an example, I went to one of the best Catholic high schools in the country. It was an elite school, but we had no grades, and it was a pass-or-fail system. There were also there were about 15 students to each class, but there were 4 classes for each freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior. Each segment had 4 actual different classes that ran at different paces. And the idea was if you were having a hard time, you actually were put into a class that went at a slower pace, so that everybody stayed. You didn't lose people. And that's one of the things that we find in the school system that we have, is that you have people young people who they haven't had their awakening yet in mathematics, or they haven't had it in reading. One of the things that children are often diagnosed as being dyslexic, or they're having reading problems because they're trying to teach them to read at 5 years or 6 years of age, and they're not ready to read yet. If they just left them alone by the time they get to 8, 9, or 10, when they're ready to read, they become quite efficient readers. So this idea of having to follow the program. Some people do not get algebra. They will never get algebra. And there are other people that don't get geometry, and they won't ever get geometry. It's you know, and to punish kids for these what are seen as universal ways of knowing. They're not universal ways of knowing. People have different ways of knowing. I went to another high school. I was, for my freshman and sophomore year there, I went to another high school, which was also a private high school, and my brother and sister went to that high school as well. But again, very small classes. We were on honor system. I don't remember cheating I hope this is not redacted memory, but I really don't remember cheating. But one of the reasons why our son, it became unbearable for him to go to the high school there, is that since the time he was very little, he's been able to do math in his head. And he's very gifted in math. We have another son that has a really hard time with math. But he was, in the testing, it became so difficult for him to keep up with the time and show the work that he just started doing these things in his head, and then he would turn the test in, and this teacher would actually mark these answers wrong that he was getting right. And when he confronted him with it, he said, "I know you're cheating." And it was so humiliating for him because he hadn't cheated before, but he said that at that school cheating was the norm. It was not the exception, it was the norm. When I was going to school, it was the exception. That's no longer the case. When I mentioned this to a medical student at the University of Stanford, I said to him, you know, how my son was telling me that everybody cheated in high school. And he said, "Yeah, no, I cheated my whole way through high school." And I said, "Are you doing that in medical school now?" And he really kind of got a blank look on his face. And it really troubled me because I'm thinking, if he cheated his way all through high school and he's going to cheat his way all through medical school, and then I have to go to him to get some operation done on me, and that was a test that he happened to have cheated on. So, I mean, I think we have a really serious problem. The other thing is, we have to ask ourselves, you know, I have a Saudi friend who's a businessman who asked one of the heads of the business school in Harvard, "Do you teach ethics at Harvard?" And he said, "Of course we do. We teach ethics." He said, "Then why are all these Harvard graduates cheating people on Wall Street?" You know, I mean, these guys are all the smartest guys in the room, the Enron guys, the guys who got 4.0 that are coming out. In fact, derivatives, most bankers could not understand this stuff. It was so complicated because the people that developed these schemes were mathematical geniuses. You can no longer go and get a PhD in economics like you used to back in the 50s or 60s. Economics was more a course in philosophy. Now it's higher mathematics, and it's very competitive and hard to get. But these guys were the brightest guys. Where were their business ethics? They seem to throw them out the window. So there's many, many issues that are going on in this film, and certainly we saw. On the one hand, all these kids are supposed to, they're all doing really well, or they're all getting straight A's and 4.0 GPAs, and all these people here, and yet they come into these places needing remedial work. I've taught courses, I taught a course at Las Positas College here, and it's really quite shocking the level after 12 years of school, students that have a really hard time writing a basic essay. One of the things I'm teaching now at a college here in Berkeley, and one of the things that is for the students that I'm teaching is that they have to get used to the fact that I'm really not interested in measuring what they know. For me, that's for them. If they're not getting something, they can tell me. But they don't need this paternalistic approach to education where the teacher has to tell them whether or not they're doing well or whether or not they're okay or not. And then the other thing about it is I don't believe in grades, and I don't really believe in testing, because I think testing is also a completely insane way of measuring whether somebody knows something. We know for a fact that most of the tests, you can get advanced scores on them by taking these very costly programs where you learn how to take tests. And you can increase, they guarantee to increase your grades by 100 points. The difference between a 600 and a 700 is the difference between getting into a good college or a bad college. So a lot of this, and I don't think the class issue was addressed enough in this film, because I think there are a lot of class issues that are going on in this film, because many of these schools out there, we've got teachers that are just trying to keep students from killing each other. And there's a 5-year burnout rate, and that poor teacher who's breaking down on the film, 5 years into teaching, most teachers now actually stop, and they can't do it anymore. What's interesting is when they're asked what is the number one reason that they're finding, when they're asked why they're leaving teaching, because they're not allowed to teach how they want to and what they want. They're being told what to teach by the state. And it's all geared towards these ridiculous tests, which is a massive industry that has immense lobbies. These are billion-dollar industries in America. The books, the tapes, the DVDs, the CDs, the videos, the tutoring, all of this stuff is money. And yet, we've got all of these young people that aren't learning basic skills, the basic skill sets. Another aspect, and this is something to think about, there's something called the Flynn effect, which is that they're seeing in testing that measures IQs, they're seeing that the IQs are going up for those types of tests that measure certain aspects of quote-unquote intelligence. But yet at the same time, they're seeing that young people are having more and more difficult time reading facial expressions. They're having a difficult time doing basic things that, in fact, there's a book coming out now, The Winter of Our Disconnect, which is about a woman who's talking about how kids don't know how to open cans or use can openers, that they don't know how. She mentions in the book about one of these kids came over to their house, and when he wanted some ice for his drink, she said it was in the ice box, and he opened it, and it was a tray, and he'd never had to use an ice cube tray before, because he was so used to just having the ice cubes come out of the refrigerator, and he didn't know what to do. And she just said to him, work it out. Work it out. So that's an aspect that's very frightening. Now, one of the things that, to me, this is indicative of an autistic personality. What we're creating, basically, I think, is a society of autistic people. People that are very good at certain things, actually can be very brilliant at them, but are completely disconnected from human interaction. My wife and I have noted for a long time, because we had 5 children, when we would go to the grocery store with all these kids at different times, and we'd have like the 2-year-old or the 1-year-old, the older people working in the grocery store would invariably stop and interact with the baby. And even sometimes speak in baby language. Hello, cutie, how are you? And do this, and there was some kind of interaction. But we would note that the younger kids that were working this would completely ignore the child, as if it wasn't even there. And there was no human interaction. What kind of mothers are going to come out, and fathers of people like that? So I think there are a lot of issues going on in this film. I'm personally against, I'm not, I use a computer and I'm not a Luddite, but I am very much opposed to introducing these things to young kids. I think it's a disaster personally. That's my personal opinion. I also think a lot of the things that kids need to learn in school are human things. There's a Persian proverb that says it's very easy to be a mullah. It's very difficult to be a human being. You can go to the madrasa and you can learn all those things. And I've met many tyrannical scholars. Our Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said, إِيَّاكُمْ وَجَبَابِرَةَ الْعُلَمَاء. Beware of tyrannical scholars. That knowledge, when it becomes a source of arrogance and a source of pride, it has the opposite effect. The more knowledgeable a person gets, the more humble they should become. I'll just end, and then we can open this up for a talk. My great-grandmother, and it's very interesting that she mentioned about Bill Gates not having a college degree. Many of the most successful people in the United States of America do not have college degrees. But again, how are we defining success? I mean, that's another, because we use these words, we throw them out, and often it's socioeconomic success. But this is a book, it's called Bain's Rhetoric. I got this from my father, who got it from his mother, who got it from her mother. So this is my great-grandmother's high school rhetoric book from Wichita Falls. It was a public high school. If you read this today, I think what will surprise you is it's written at a postgraduate level. Somebody today, even who has higher degrees, I think would have a difficult time reading it. But I just want to, there's a section on appeal to emotions, and I thought, what an interesting thing to teach high school students about how they can be manipulated by orators. In that section, and I also know because my great-grandmother noted there's a page here that has a little note from her. It says, Lily Cummings, December 10th, 1880, had a terrible toothache today. So it's an unusual thing to know about your great-grandmother, that every December 10th I'll have to try to remember that. But in this section it says, thirdly, the emotions and passions as fear, love, self-esteem, power, anger, ridicule, aesthetic emotion, religion, the moral sentiment. He says, in one respect, these may be viewed as pleasures or pains and as attracting or deterring us according to their felt intensity, whether they be actual or anticipated. Such are the pleasures of affection, of self-complacency, revenge, fine art, and the pains of sorrow, humiliation, remorse. In another aspect, they take on the character of passions or inflammation, disturbing the fair calculations of the will and inducing us to act without reference to our pleasures or our pains. Fear, terror, or dread, whatever pains us, is an object of avoidance, according to our sense of the pain. This is not fear, but the usual attitude of precaution against harm. But on certain occasions, pain in prospect is accompanied with a tremulous and unhinging excitement, under which the powers are enfeebled and rational calculation is interfered with, every other interest being sacrificed to the morbid impulse. And this is a high school textbook. Terror is a powerful agent in overcoming the contumacious and self-willed disposition, and is made use of in government, in religion, and in education. The passion may be excited by the mere prospect of great suffering, but still more effectually by unknown dangers, uncertainties, and vast possibilities of evil in matters keenly felt by the hearers. The approach of unexperienced calamities is apt to engender panic. Under a plague or epidemic, people may be easily frightened into measures that in cool moments they would repudiate. The sick and the depressed can readily be inspired with religious and moral terrors. History furnishes many examples of political oratory succeeding through the excitement of terror. I mean, if that's what they were teaching high school students in the 1880s, I don't think somebody like George Bush could have ever got elected, right? So it's very interesting that we're living in a time when our young people need more than ever to have the tools to be vigilant against demagoguery, against propaganda, advertising. I would recommend all of you, if you haven't read Dorothy Sayers' extraordinary article that's in the little booklet there on education, I would really, you can read it online. So I know I'm but it supports Kinza Academy, so you can buy it too. But it's the lost tools of learning. And in that, Dorothy Sayers, who at one point wrote advertisement copy, so she knew very well the secrets of advertising. She's noted for her mystery writing, but she was also a great theologian. And The Mind of the Maker is an extraordinary book. She translated Dante, the Divine Comedy, wrote the best essay, hands down, I've ever read on the 7 deadly sins. And she was largely homeschooled. Her father began teaching her Latin at the age of 7. And she wrote a stunning essay on why you should learn Latin early as opposed to in high school. She said that to learn mensa, mensae,